They were told the truth before they ever boarded the trucks. This mission had no promises, no guarantees, and almost no chance of survival. The commanders didn't sugarcoat it because there was no point. Everyone in that briefing room knew they were being sent where even seasoned veterans refused to go. But what none of the officers could explain, what no map, no speech, no diagram could capture, was why these ordinary men refused to hesitate. Some had been farm hands, some factory workers, some barely out of high school. But when the orders came down, they stepped forward as if destiny itself had tapped them on the shoulder. They weren't chosen because they were the strongest, or the fastest, or the most decorated. They were chosen because they were willing. Willing to walk straight into a mission designed on a sheet of paper without a single escape route drawn on it. It was a simple objective, at least on the surface. Strike deep behind enemy lines, sabotage a fortified strongpoint, and hold out until reinforcements could reach them, if reinforcements ever reached them at all. Intelligence labeled the target as strategically vital. The men later learned that was code for something even harsher. If this position stays in enemy hands, American casualties on the front will double. That sentence alone was enough to silence every doubt. The night before departure, they gathered in a dimly lit hangar, the cold concrete echoing with quiet footsteps and whispered conversations. Some wrote letters, some cleaned their rifles for the third or fourth time. Others simply stared at the ground, replaying the briefing in their minds. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood. This wasn't a mission you came back from unchanged, if you came back at all. When the final check came, the commanding officer stepped forward. He didn't shout. He didn't try to inspire them with speeches about glory or destiny. He simply looked at them, one by one, and said the only words that mattered. What you do tomorrow will save men you will never meet, and no one will ever forget it. The engines roared to life outside, shaking the walls with a heavy, bone-deep vibration. It was time. The men rose, pulled on their packs, slung their rifles, and formed a line that felt less like soldiers preparing for war and more like brothers marching into the unknown. As they stepped into the cold night air, the sky above was silent, almost peaceful, completely unaware of the storm about to be unleashed beneath it. And in that moment, something settled over them, a quiet certainty that whatever happened next, whatever waited in the darkness ahead, they would face it together. They walked toward the transports not as ordinary Americans anymore, but as the men who had volunteered for a mission no one expected them to survive. And by dawn, the world would know their name. The convoy moved under blackout conditions, crawling down narrow country roads that twisted through forests and farmland. No headlights, no chatter. Just the low rumble of engines and the steady breathing of men who had accepted that every mile forward brought them closer to a point of no return. The destination wasn't printed on any map they carried. It was a place the enemy considered untouchable, protected by terrain, artillery, and a network of patrols that had crushed every previous attempt to break through. Inside the transports, the men sat shoulder to shoulder, each lost in his own thoughts. Some rehearsed the route again and again, tracing invisible lines on their knees. Others checked the same piece of equipment repeatedly, knowing it wouldn't calm them but needing something to do with their hands. A few simply stared ahead, steady and silent, understanding that fear was natural but hesitation was fatal. The briefing had been clear. The enemy strongpoint controlled a bottleneck in the valley, a single choke passage through which reinforcements and ammunition flowed. It wasn't just a position, it was the backbone of the enemy's supply line. Destroy it, and the front would shift. Fail, and the enemy would hold the advantage for weeks, maybe months. Scouts had tried reaching it, artillery had tried softening it, air support had made runs, but the terrain shielded the position like a fortress carved by nature itself. In the end, only one option remained. Send in a small hand-picked unit capable of moving silently, striking fast, and holding long enough for the rest of the army to break through. The suicide mission, commanders called it in private. The men inside the transports never asked for a different name. As the convoy reached the final drop-off point, the trucks rolled to a stop, engines idling low. The night was thick with mist, carrying the faint smell of pine and distant gunpowder. The men climbed out quietly, adjusting their packs, tightening straps, lifting rifles as if they were extensions of their own arms. Ahead of them stretched a valley swallowed in darkness, broken only by the silhouette of distant ridgelines. Somewhere beyond those ridges lay the strongpoint, an underground bunker system reinforced with steel, concrete, and enough firepower to shred a larger force before it ever came close. Their commanding officer crouched beside a map illuminated by a single covered light. He pointed toward a narrow ravine almost invisible against the terrain. "This is your entry. No roads, no markers. Stay inside the shadows, move slow, and you'll bypass their outer patrols." Then he looked up at them, letting the silence settle. "Once you're in," he said, "you're on your own. No radio support. No extraction until the objective is complete. If the enemy realizes you're inside that valley, they will throw everything they have at shutting it down." The men nodded. No questions, no complaints. They knew why they were here. As they formed a staggered column and began their descent into the ravine, the world above them seemed to fade, the roads, the trucks, the last traces of safety disappearing behind them. The forest closed in, branches reaching overhead like skeletal fingers. Their boots made no sound on the damp earth. Their breath fogged in the cold air, then vanished instantly. They were deep behind enemy lines before the sky shifted even a shade. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, the strongpoint waited, silent, fortified, and unaware that ordinary Americans were walking straight into its jaws. Not because they expected to survive, but because the mission demanded men willing to try. The ravine narrowed as they moved deeper, forcing the men into single file. Above them, the steep walls blocked the moonlight, leaving only a faint silver glow filtering through the branches. It was the kind of darkness that played tricks on the mind. Every rustle felt like footsteps. Every broken twig felt like a warning. But the men pressed forward, guided by instinct, discipline, and the quiet resolve that had carried them this far. When the ravine finally opened into a small clearing, they froze. Ahead, carved into the hillside, sat a concealed enemy outpost. Nothing large, nothing fortified, just a two-man listening post meant to catch anyone foolish enough to approach from this side. The enemy soldiers inside were speaking softly, unaware that danger was only yards away. Manton raised his hand, signaling the men to drop low. They spread out around the clearing, rifles steady, movements slow and deliberate. This wasn't a fight they wanted to start. It was a fight they needed to finish before a single alarm could be raised. Cordell crawled forward, using the roots and fallen branches as cover. When he reached the blind spot behind the outpost, he waited for Manton's nod. It came after a long, tense moment. Cordell moved in, quiet as a shadow, and the struggle ended before the enemy could shout a word. The second soldier met the same fate. The clearing remained silent. The men dragged the bodies into the brush, covered the small structure, and continued forward. Every step now felt heavier. They were inside the enemy's defensive shell, an invisible line where the difference between life and death could be measured in seconds. The forest around them seemed to breathe, every gust of wind sliding through the pines like a whisper reminding them how deep they had ventured. Half a mile ahead, they reached their first real obstacle, a wire communication line running between two wooden posts. It was the lifeline of the strongpoint, connecting bunkers across the valley. Manton knelt beside it, studying the direction it ran. "This is it," he whispered. "This leads straight to the main bunker." The men went to work with precision. Wire cutters snipped through the line in 3 separate places. Cordell placed a small time charge beneath the base of the nearest pole. Nothing large, just enough to bring it down later and mask the sabotage as environmental damage. But before they could move on, a distant engine rumbled to life. The sound rolled across the valley, low and slow, Not a patrol, not a car, a generator. It meant the bunker complex was fully manned, powered, and preparing for something bigger than routine operations. The men exchanged uneasy glances. Whatever the enemy was doing, they were working through the night to prepare for it. The unit climbed out of the clearing and followed the communication line through the forest until they reached a ridge overlooking the valley floor. And there it was, the strongpoint they had been sent to destroy. Massive concrete bunkers dug into the hillside, steel doors, spotlights sweeping across trenches, machine gun nests guarding every approach, and at the center a fortified command post humming with activity. It wasn't just a strongpoint, it was a fortress. The men crouched among the roots, steadying their breathing, absorbing the sight before them. No one spoke, no one needed to. They understood now why every attempt to crack this position had failed, why this mission was considered suicidal, why they were the ones chosen. The commanding officer studied the layout through his binoculars. After a long, silent moment, he lowered them and turned to his men. "This is the heart of their line," he said quietly. "We take this out, the entire valley collapses. From here on, every move counts." The men nodded, checking their ammunition, tightening their grips. Behind them lay the last safe inch of forest. Ahead of them lay the mission that would either make them legends or bury them beneath the pines. The men descended from the ridge in a tight formation, staying inside the darkest lines of shadow as they approached the fortified valley floor. The strongpoint loomed ahead like a sleeping beast, massive concrete angles hidden beneath layers of earth, camouflage netting draped over gun ports, and narrow trenches cutting through the terrain like veins. Every 50 yards, a guard tower stood watch, each one manned, each one wired into the network they had just severed. For the moment, no alarm sounded. The silence was their only ally. Manton led the unit toward a drainage culvert that ran beneath the outer trench line, a narrow, rusted pipe barely wide enough for a man to crawl through. Intelligence suggested it was rarely checked. It was their best chance to slip inside without drawing fire. One by one, they slid into the cold metal tube, crawling on elbows, water soaking their uniforms as the pipe echoed with every movement. The darkness inside was suffocating, pressing on their nerves, but the thought of being caught outside, illuminated by spotlights, kept them moving. When they emerged on the other side, they found themselves inside a shallow maintenance ditch behind a storage bunker. Voices drifted from above, German soldiers talking casually, unaware that American boots were already on the inside. The men crouched low, their breaths controlled, waiting for the patrol to pass. Manton pointed toward a blind corner leading to the rear entrance of the first bunker. 2 guards stood there, rifles slung casually over their shoulders. They weren't expecting danger from within. That mistake would cost them. Cordell and Ellis slipped forward silently. The takedown was quick, clean, and without a sound. The Americans dragged the bodies into the shadows and checked the door, unlocked. Inside, the bunker hummed with generator noise. Rows of ammunition crates lined the walls. Maps pinned to boards showed artillery ranges, supply schedules, and reinforcement routes. It was more than they expected. It was the operational brain of the entire valley. Manton immediately signaled for the men to plant charges. They worked with practiced precision, placing explosives beneath structural supports and along fuel storage drums. Every second counted. At any moment, a guard could open the door and change everything, but fate stayed quiet. As they moved to the next section, a sudden vibration rolled through the floor. The generator was ramping up, powering something large. A siren wailed briefly in the distance, but not an alarm. It was a logistic signal calling enemy troops to rotate positions along the ridge. Their window to escape was shrinking. The men hurried down a narrow corridor leading to an exit on the far side of the bunker. But just as they reached for the door, heavy footsteps sounded from the other side. A patrol, more than one. They stepped back, pressed flat against the walls. The footsteps passed, then stopped. A German voice called out, suspicious, sensing something wrong, a door ajar that shouldn't be, a shadow out of place. The Americans froze. Any sound now would bring the whole strongpoint down on them. Then Manton made the decision that defined the mission. He motioned toward a side chamber, an auxiliary maintenance room with thick concrete walls. If they slipped inside and waited for the patrol to move on, they might avoid detection. But if the patrol entered the room first, they would be trapped with no exit except through the enemy. The men followed him in without hesitation. The Germans reached the corridor entrance. Their footsteps paused. One of them muttered something in a concerned tone. A flashlight beam swept across the doorway, just inches from revealing the hidden Americans. Then, finally, mercifully, the patrol moved on. The flashlight faded. Boots marched away. Silence returned. Manton exhaled and checked his watch. They were still on schedule, but barely. The charges needed time to arm, and they needed distance before the valley erupted. He looked back at the men, their faces tense but unbroken. "We're inside," he whispered. "Now we finish it." Ahead lay the deeper tunnels, the true heart of the strongpoint. And somewhere inside those tunnels was the single weak point that could bring the entire fortress crashing down. The deeper they moved into the strongpoint, the narrower the tunnels became. Concrete walls pressed close on both sides, marked with years of grime and the oil stains of machinery that never stopped running. The air was thick with the smell of fuel, damp earth, and metal. A low hum echoed through the corridor, steady, mechanical, almost like the fortress itself was breathing. This was no simple bunker. It was an underground machine. Manton signaled the men forward, their boots landing softly on the concrete floor. Every sound mattered now. A dropped rifle, a loose canteen, even a careless exhale could bounce through the tunnels like a flare. They hugged the corners, checked each intersection twice, and moved with the precision of surgeons navigating a maze of arteries. They reached a junction where 3 tunnels met. A sign in German hung crookedly overhead, pointing toward storage, barracks, and something labeled control room. The control room, the place that powered everything, the comms, the floodlights, the reinforced doors, and the ventilation systems. If they destroyed that section, the whole strongpoint would choke and collapse in confusion. Manton pointed to it immediately. The control room was the target, but getting there meant passing directly through a busy artery of the complex. They could already hear voices ahead, German operators talking over maps, a phone ringing, the faint clatter of equipment being moved. The room wasn't heavily guarded, but it was fully manned. An assault would alert the entire valley. Silence wasn't an option anymore. Timing was. Cordell slid a charge from his pack, small, shaped, perfect for breaching without bringing the ceiling down. He placed it along the maintenance hatch connected to the control room wall. On Manton's signal, the men moved into position, rifles raised. The explosion wasn't loud, more like a sharp metallic punch. Dust shot from the seams of the wall and the hatch blew inward, clattering across the floor. Before the dust could settle, the Americans stormed through the breach. The Germans inside froze, some reaching for rifles, others scrambling for radios. The Americans fired in controlled bursts, clearing the room in seconds. When the last echo faded, the hum of the machinery seemed louder than ever. They had done the impossible, taken the nerve center without raising an alarm. Manton immediately scanned the panels, banks of switches, gauges, and power relays. Most were incomprehensible at a glance, but the key systems were obvious from the wiring alone. Ventilation, power, communications, floodlights. All of it fed through a reinforced electrical spine running into the floor. Cordell crouched beside the junction box. "If we overload this, everything goes down. But once it blows, we have seconds to get out before they flood the tunnels." "Do it," Manton said. Cordell set the charge, connected the wires, and flipped the arming switch. A small red light blinked to life. 2 minutes. The men moved fast, exiting the control room and retracing their steps through the narrow tunnels. But halfway back to the culvert escape route, a shouted command echoed from behind them. A German patrol had finally discovered the breach. Manton didn't have to say it. Everyone broke into a run. Boots hammered the concrete. German voices grew louder. A siren blared, the alarm they had avoided until now. Light bulbs flickered overhead as the power grid destabilized. Then a deep, heavy rumble rolled through the floor like the valley itself was groaning. The fortress was waking up. They reached the drainage culvert entrance just as the first explosion detonated deep inside the complex. A blast wave shoved dust and hot air through the tunnel, almost knocking the men off their feet. Flames licked up the corridor behind them, lights dying in a chain reaction that plunged everything into darkness. Manton shouted, "Go! Go!" One by one, the men dove into the metal pipe, crawling as the sounds of collapsing concrete echoed behind them. The fuse chain had worked. The strongpoint was tearing itself apart from the inside out. They scrambled out into the forest just as a final eruption ripped through the hillside, sending a plume of smoke and fire pouring into the night sky. The valley shook. Birds scattered from the trees. A shockwave rippled across the fields. The fortress was dead, but the enemy was not. Gunfire erupted from the tree line. German troops were already closing in, firing blindly into the darkness to cut off escape. The Americans had destroyed the strongpoint. Now they had to survive long enough to make it out alive. The hillside behind them was still collapsing, sending rolling echoes through the valley as chunks of concrete and steel gave way. Flames licked out of the shattered entrances, painting the night sky in violent flashes of orange. The strongpoint, the fortress everyone said was untouchable, was now a burning wound carved into the earth. They had done it. But the victory came with a price. The explosions had given away everything: their position, their route, their only escape path. German troops were already pouring into the forest from every direction, their shouts cutting through the smoke-filled air. Searchlights swept across the treetops. Dogs barked in the distance. Dozens of rifles opened fire blindly into the darkness. Manton's unit dove behind a fallen tree, bullets snapping overhead. The earth trembled as another explosion roared beneath the hillside. Cordell wiped ash from his eyes, coughing as dust filled the air. "They're sealing the whole valley," he said. "We stay here, we die here." Manton scanned the terrain. The forest dropped into a narrow ravine leading to a stream, shallow, rocky, and surrounded by thick brush. It wasn't on their escape map, but it sloped away from the enemy's tightening circle. It was the only chance they had. "Down the ravine!" Manton ordered. "Stay low and stay moving." The men sprinted through the undergrowth as the Germans burst through the trees behind them. Tracer fire streaked through the branches, illuminating brief snapshots of chaos: shattered roots, flying dirt, the twisted remnants of a steel grate blown out of the hillside. The Americans slid down the ravine, boots skidding on wet stone. The stream at the bottom was freezing, but the water masked their movement and muffled their footsteps. They slogged through it as fast as they could, rifles raised above the surface, shivering as icy water soaked into their uniforms. Then came the sound that froze them in place. A flare fired into the sky, bright white, drifting down slowly. It exposed everything: the forest, the stream, and Manton's entire unit standing waist-deep in the water. Shouts erupted on the ridge. Multiple rifles opened fire. Bullets peppered the stream around them, splashing like tiny explosions. Ellis pushed a wounded man behind a boulder, shielding him with his own body. Cordell fired controlled bursts toward the ridge, not to hit anyone, but to force the Germans to duck. "Move!" Manton shouted. "Don't stop!" They rushed forward, slipping, falling, dragging each other back to their feet. The flare's harsh glow finally dimmed, giving them a precious few seconds of darkness. They veered left, following the stream until it widened into a marshy patch where reeds grew tall enough to hide in. The men dropped into the brush, lying flat as German patrols spread out across the valley floor. Searchlights swept the stream. Boots splashed through the water only a dozen yards away. One patrol paused so close that the Americans could hear the soldiers breathe. For long, agonizing seconds, no one moved. Not a breath, not a whisper. The patrol finally moved on. When the last footsteps faded, Manton signaled the men to crawl through the reeds toward the far tree line. Beyond that line lay the route back to friendly positions, a long march but open ground compared to the death trap behind them. They emerged from the marsh soaked, freezing, and barely standing, but they kept walking, step after step, mile after mile. The night sky slowly gave way to a pale, bruised dawn. Hours later, as they crested a hill overlooking a liberated sector, an American outpost spotted them, mud-covered, smoke-stained silhouettes staggering out of the forest like ghosts. When the soldiers at the outpost ran to meet them, one of them asked, "Where did you boys come from?" Manton answered with a voice cracked by smoke and exhaustion, "From where no one was supposed to." They hadn't just survived the mission. They had destroyed a fortress, crippled a valley, and escaped an entire battalion hunting them in the dark. Ordinary Americans no longer. They had become legends, one impossible step at a time. By the time Manton's unit reached the perimeter of friendly lines, the sky had shifted from a bruised dawn to a calm morning haze. The men looked nothing like the soldiers who had marched into the night. Their uniforms were torn, boots soaked, helmets dented, faces streaked with ash and dried mud. Some limped, some leaned on rifles like walking sticks, and some carried their wounded brothers across their shoulders. But every one of them was still moving. The first American checkpoint stared in disbelief. No one had expected survivors, not from this mission, not from the valley that High Command had quietly labeled a death sentence. Medics rushed forward, officers followed with urgent questions, but the men were too exhausted to answer, too drained to relive the firestorm they had escaped. Manton handed over the only explanation that anyone truly needed. "It's done. The strongpoint is gone." Those 6 words carried enough weight to tilt the entire front line. When news reached the command post, operations officers rechecked their maps twice. Units that had been pinned down for days suddenly found the enemy's pressure lifting. Supply routes reopened. Reinforcements flowed through gaps that didn't exist the night before. Every shift in the battlefield traced back to one glowing dot on the map, the fortress that no longer stood. Later that afternoon, Manton's men were gathered in a makeshift medical tent. Some sat on folding cots, others rested on the ground, leaning back against crates. The silence was thick but peaceful, a rare pause in a war that never gave them more than a moment to breathe. A high-ranking officer entered without ceremony. He looked at each man, not with pity, but with something closer to awe. He didn't lecture them about bravery or sacrifice. He didn't read from a script or mention medals. He simply said, "You changed the course of this fight, and you did it with no support, no fallback, and no certainty you'd live to see the sunrise. That makes you the kind of soldiers history will never forget." Some of the men lowered their gaze. Others stared into the distance, replaying the tunnels, the fire, the chase through the ravine. None of them felt like heroes. They felt like survivors, lucky in ways that defied explanation. But the truth of their mission spread quickly. Word traveled from platoon to platoon. A small American unit destroyed the Valley Fortress. They went in knowing they wouldn't come back. The suicide squad lived. And slowly, the myth grew. The kind that soldiers cling to when the nights get long and the fear creeps in. The kind that reminds them courage isn't loud or perfect. It's a choice made in silence by men who refuse to step back. When Manton finally stepped outside the tent, the afternoon sun warmed his face. The battlefield noises continued somewhere beyond the hills. Distant artillery, trucks rolling, orders being shouted. But here, for a brief moment, there was calm. Cordell walked up beside him. Think they'll ever know what it was like in there? Manton shook his head. They're not supposed to. They just need to know we did our part. He looked back at his men, bandaged, exhausted, but alive. They had entered the valley as ordinary Americans. They walked out as something else entirely. Not because they wanted glory, not because they expected medals, but because they stepped forward when the mission demanded men willing to walk into darkness and drag victory back into the light. Those who survived would never be the same. Those who fell would never be forgotten. And the world would remember their story by the name whispered across the front lines, the legends who weren't supposed to come home. The medical tents gave the men temporary shelter, but rest was a luxury none of them could truly afford. Manton and a few from his unit sat on wooden crates outside, bandaged, exhausted, staring at the smoke still rising far behind enemy lines where the fortress had once stood. They had survived, but the mission wasn't over. Not for them, not for the front. Command had already begun shifting artillery and infantry through the corridor the men had opened. The collapse of the strongpoint created a gap the army had been waiting weeks for, but that victory placed new weight on the shoulders of the survivors. Suddenly, every officer wanted details, tunnels, defenses, possible counterattacks. Manton answered what he could, but his eyes kept drifting toward the hills, expecting the enemy to strike back at any moment. They didn't have to wait long. Just past noon, distant thunder rolled through the valley. Not explosions, engines. The low mechanical growl of armored units regrouping behind the ruined fortress. Recon patrols returned with grim news. The enemy was preparing a counteroffensive to reclaim the corridor. If they succeeded, everything the Americans had gained would collapse. Manton rose slowly, pain radiating down his ribs but determination burning behind his eyes. "We're not finished," he said. "Not yet." His men gathered, weary but unbroken. They had no intention of watching the enemy rebuild what they had bled to destroy. Command ordered them to join a blocking force positioned at the mouth of the valley. It wasn't supposed to be a major engagement, just hold long enough for reinforcements to dig in. But when the first German shells thundered overhead and shattered against the hillside, the truth became clear. The enemy wanted the valley back at any cost. The men took positions along a shallow ridge overlooking the corridor. Sandbags, broken stone, and scattered logs offered minimal cover, but it was all they had. Manton crawled beside Cordell, who was securing a machine gun salvaged from the strongpoint's ruins. "They're coming hard," Cordell muttered. "They're angry," Manton replied. "We hit them where it hurt." The first German infantry push came fast, shadows moving through the smoke, rifles raised, supported by bursts of machine gun fire. The Americans opened up, holding the line through sheer willpower. Dirt exploded around them. Shrapnel zipped through the air. The ridge became a wall of noise and fear and grit, but the line held. Then came the armor. A German half-track rolled through the dust, turret swiveling. Soldiers dove for deeper cover as the vehicle opened fire. The ridge buckled under the pressure. For a moment, the line faltered, but broken men don't break twice. Cordell's machine gun roared to life, cutting a blazing path across the slope. Ellis hurled a grenade that landed perfectly beneath the half-track's front wheel. The explosion tore the vehicle sideways, flames erupting from its hull. German troops scattered, shocked by the sudden reversal. The Americans rallied. They fired until barrels smoked, until wrists went numb, until their uniforms were covered in powder and ash. Each minute they held bought time. Time for reinforcements, time for artillery to reposition, time for the front to stabilize. By late afternoon, the counterattack finally began to wither. German forces retreated into the haze, dragging their wounded, abandoning equipment, conceding what they had fought desperately to reclaim. When the battlefield fell silent again, the ridge was littered with shell fragments and scorched earth. The Americans collapsed behind their makeshift cover, lungs burning, ears ringing, faces streaked with sweat and dust. They had survived the fortress. They had survived the valley. And now they had survived the counterattack meant to erase them. But the war wasn't done with them. Not yet. As the smoke from the counterattack drifted away, the battlefield settled into an eerie quiet. No cheering, no relief. Just the low groans of wounded men and the distant crack of rifles from other parts of the front. Manton's unit lay scattered along the ridge, catching their breath, staring into the haze that still hung over the valley they had bled to secure. Medics moved quickly, checking bandages, applying morphine, dragging the worst cases toward evacuation trucks. Some of the men refused to go, insisting on staying with their squad. Others sat in silence, unable to process the fact that they had survived yet another onslaught that should have killed them. Manton walked the line slowly, checking on every man who had followed him into the fortress and out again. Ellis was sitting against a broken tree stump, his sleeve soaked with blood but his eyes steady. Cordell was cleaning a jammed rifle, hands trembling from exhaustion but refusing to show it. Another soldier, barely 19, stared blankly at his boots as if they belonged to someone else. This was the price of survival, not medals, not glory, but the quiet aftermath no one wrote about. Command finally arrived to assess the ridge. A colonel stepped out of a jeep, surveyed the destruction, and approached Manton with a look that mixed disbelief and respect. "Your operation blew a hole through their entire defensive spine," he said. "We've been trying to take this valley for a month. You did it in a night." Manton didn't smile. He didn't boast. He simply nodded. "My men did what they were sent to do." The colonel gestured toward the distant ruins of the strongpoint. Smoke still curled from the shattered concrete, drifting in long black ribbons across the hills. "You understand what that means, right? This changes the next phase of the campaign. Units across the front can finally push forward." But Manton didn't need the explanation. He already knew. Every man who had survived understood the weight of what they had won and the cost they had paid to win it. Later, when the wounded were evacuated and the ridge secured, a small ceremony took place around sundown. Nothing formal, nothing rehearsed, just the men of the unit standing together as the last light of the day filtered through the smoke. A chaplain said a few quiet words for those who hadn't made it back. Helmets were placed on rifles stabbed into the dirt. Dog tags hung from bayonets. The wind carried the scent of pine and cordite, mixing memory with reality in a way that felt almost unbearable. Some men cried without sound. Others stood rigid, jaws locked, refusing to let emotion break through the thin shell holding them together. Cordell clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. Ellis bowed his head, whispering something no one else could hear. Manton stepped forward. He didn't speak long. "We walked into that valley knowing what it might cost," he said. "But we came out because we refused to let each other fall. That's what makes us who we are. Not the mission, not the orders, each other." The men nodded, some barely, but the message landed in every chest. As darkness fell, the ridge glowed with the last embers of burning brush and shattered machinery. The valley below was quiet, too quiet for a place that had witnessed so much violence in so little time. But in that silence lay something rare on a battlefield, a sense of meaning. They hadn't just destroyed a fortress. They hadn't just opened a path for the army. They had proven something commanders often forgot. Ordinary Americans could accomplish the impossible when the mission demanded it. They were battered, they were bruised, but they were still standing, and the world would soon know why. The valley was unrecognizable by the next morning. What had once been a fortress of steel and concrete was now a smoldering scar across the hillside. Craters smoked. Walls that had stood for years now lay folded in on themselves like broken ribs. And the narrow ridge where Manton's unit had fought their final stand was littered with the silent evidence of a night that reshaped the battlefield. But for the first time in weeks, the valley belonged to the Americans. Infantry units streamed through the opening the men had carved. Engineers marked safe paths. Artillery rolled forward to new firing positions. The entire front line shifted because a small group of soldiers had done what no one else could. Manton and his men watched from a distance, leaning on rifles, shoulders wrapped in bandages. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. Every truck that passed, every platoon that crossed the ridge, every officer who paused to salute them, those were acknowledgments more powerful than medals. News of the mission spread fast. Word reached division headquarters, then Corps Command. Soon the entire sector referred to the unit by a name whispered half in disbelief, half in admiration: the Suicide Squad that lived. Reporters tried to interview them, but the men turned them away. They weren't interested in glory. They were still processing what they had survived. Friends lost in the tunnels, moments where death had been inches away, the sound of the fortress tearing itself apart behind them. In the afternoon, a general arrived by jeep. He walked straight toward Manton's men, boots crunching on broken stone. He didn't arrive with photographers or aides. He came alone, the gravity of the moment reflected in his expression. "You did something historic," he said. "Long after this war ends, long after we're all gone, soldiers will study what you accomplished here. Not because you were ordered to do it, but because you refused to fail." He paused, searching their faces. "I won't insult you with speeches. Just know this: you changed the course of the campaign, and every man on this front owes you more than he'll ever know." He saluted them, slow, deliberate, respectful. Manton and his men returned the gesture, though some hands shook from exhaustion. As evening settled, the unit gathered on a small rise overlooking the valley. Smoke drifted upward, glowing red in the sunset. It looked almost peaceful from this distance, a cruel contrast to the nightmare they had lived through. Cordell broke the silence first. "Think anyone back home will believe this happened?" Manton smirked faintly. "Doesn't matter if they believe it. We were here." The men sat quietly, absorbing the weight of those words. They didn't feel like legends. They felt human, tired, wounded, but alive. Maybe that was the point. Legends weren't born from perfection. They were born from moments where ordinary men did impossible things because no one else would. When night finally fell, the valley grew silent again. The flames dimmed, the machinery quieted, the world exhaled. And in that silence, the truth of their journey settled like ash on the battlefield. They had walked into darkness with no promise of return. They had shattered a fortress no one else could break. They had survived a mission designed to kill them, and by doing so, they had altered the fate of thousands. They weren't the strongest. They weren't the fastest. They weren't chosen by destiny. They were ordinary Americans who answered an impossible call and became legends.